Hello, everyone. This is Patri Yates. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement here at Thunderbird. And we're really excited to have you all on the webinar today. Thank you so much for joining. For those of you where it's early in the morning or whether it's afternoon or late at night for some of you over elsewhere, we're excited for a really good lineup of and very timely and interesting topic today. This is our third webinar in our monthly series. We've started these just after the first of the year, and we'll be holding these the last Wednesday of every month throughout the year. So if this is the first one that you're joining, welcome. We hope that you'll find this interesting and continue to join us each month. And for those of you who've been on the last few webinars, thanks for coming back. We're glad to have you. We are recording these webinars and we'll provide links to the recordings. So for people who are unable to attend due to the time zone differences, we will have options for people to listen to them later. So if you, at the end of this, you'll get a survey with some questions just so that we can continue to provide webinars on topics that are of interest to you, but also any feedback that you have for us, we welcome. We'll be sending in our monthly newsletter links around to this webinar as well as previous webinars. So if you missed our last two webinars, one with Hala Thomas-Daughter, who's an incredible alum who spoke on the B team and the movement that she's leading in that space. She spoke last month. We have a recording on her webinar as well as previous webinars too. So hopefully these are great opportunities for you to continue to engage with the school, with our great faculty like Professor Lynch, who's joining us today, as well as the incredible alumni that we have out doing great work in the field, and some of whom you'll get to hear today on our panel. Every month we'll change it up a little bit and have faculty and alumni, and we'll also be changing up the time a little bit so that we can kind of cover all the time zones around the world. So this one we're having it in the morning in Phoenix. Next month we'll have our next webinar in the afternoon. So we'll try to keep things, covering various topics and highlighting lots of the great work that our faculty and alumni are doing. And with that, I would like to introduce you to Professor Lynch, who has graciously offered to lead our webinar today and pull together an incredible group of alumni for this panel and discussion. He's leading this and doing a lot of work with us here at Thunderbird, both in the classroom and through our executive ed work. And Patrick, I will hand it over to you. I know you have the slides to share, and so I'll let you take control of that, or I can pass it off to you so that you can share your slides now. Sorry, I think I may have muted in the beginning of our meeting. We had some problems with the mute, so I muted people, and I will unmute all of our panelists now. It's a quiet panel when you mute all of your panelists. And Patrick, I'm going to push you over to the host right now.
Super. Thank you so much, Petra.
There you go. You should be able to share your screen now.
So sorry for the delay here on my side. I just want to know what I'm to click. When I do click, and I have used Zoom on the share option, I'm only getting the option to stop sharing another screen. Do I want to continue? I'm afraid to press that.
Okay, should be able to go. So are you able to do share screen now?
Okay, now I am. Something's changed. That's great. All right.
Sometimes there's a bit of a delay. Apologies for that.
Okay. Just, hate to disconnect everyone there.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm trying to share the first screen of the presentation today, so hopefully that's confirmed that we're doing that right.
We can see everything great. Thank you, Patrick.
Cheers. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Good day, good evening. So happy to have this opportunity. Really great thanks to Thunderbird's leadership here for allowing us this opportunity to share. And we have compiled an excellent set of panelists today that I'm going to get to in just a moment, and I'll have them introduce themselves. Before we get too far along, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how I connected with Thunderbird. I think all of us in the Thunderbird family were saddened this week by the sudden news of Chelsea Olson's passing. Our dean has sent out a note. Maybe some of you have seen that elsewhere. But many of the panelists today, and indeed certainly many of you might have known Chelsea. She was very active in the alumni community, both locally here and internationally with Thunderbird, and served in administrative roles for Thunderbird for many years. And we want to show this in honor of her today, of continuing Thunderbird's mission. So she's made excellent contributions to us in our community, and she will be sorely missed. So the topic that we have the opportunity to reflect on today, really in the spirit of that mission, is some new developments around cybersecurity threats, and particularly a leadership, a managerial perspective on how these developments are changing in light of Industry 4.0. You know, we have compiled, I think, a set of outstanding both alums and also industry experts that our alums are working with. So, and I think it's better for each of them to briefly introduce themselves. So I'm going to have, in just a moment, I'm going to go through here, Anthony, Bianca, Aileen, Milena, and then, of course, I'll be your host today, trying to coordinate this excellent ring of masters around cyber. So with that, Anthony, can you just share a little bit about yourself, and particularly highlighting your experience around cyber for our participants?
Absolutely. Thank you, Patrick. So Anthony DeSilva, actually the Director of Product Development for Security Services at Phoenix Snap. And what that means is I get to envision and kind of create what our cyber solutions look like. My primary responsibility is cyber defense, right? What we call the blue team, and creating solutions around how do we defend against the attacks we're getting, but also how do we try to get ahead of the threat and try to prevent it before it happens. 26 years in IT, about 15 of it focused on cyber. And off to Bianca.
Yes, good morning. My name is Bianca Lackner. I am the Chief Information Officer for Tolleson Union High School District, and I'm also the co-founder and co-chair of the Cybersecurity Council of Arizona. We formed the council last year because there was a great need for skill set in the cybersecurity field, and we wanted to support those who either want to pivot from an IT career into cybersecurity, or they want to enter the field, with to provide them with opportunities for certifications, for mentorship, but also with job placement. So we welcome any of you who would like to help us be advisors for our council or mentor some of our individuals who need our help. So let me know, ping me later. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. This is Aileen Filmus. Milena and I both come from First Bright Security, which is a cybersecurity consulting services firm. The firm specializes in a range of services, from threat and vulnerability management to application pen testing. But Milena and I focus on an area called geopolitical risk. And so what that means is really the intersection of cybersecurity and what we call driving or causal factors that are in the political, socioeconomic, cultural, legal realm that contribute to, or in some cases exacerbate, cybersecurity threats. And so we're here today to contribute how we can into your discussion, and happy to answer any questions about our firm or our backgrounds.
I think Aileen covered it, so back to you, Patrick.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Milena. Well, in the interest of time, because I know that we do have a lot to get to today, and so I think we'll, proceed with that. And it's very difficult, actually, to put our arms around this topic, especially in such a short amount of time. I know every participant here, every discussant here firmly recommends that we ought to have a series of these things so we can explore all the different facets and implications for Industry 4.0. But we endeavor today to break this down into three main areas. We're going to outline sort of the state of the situation, where we're looking at some of the evolving and pervasive attacks that have morphed and are affecting companies, some of which I think you can relate to, maybe personally, or maybe regrettably some of your companies have been caught up in some of these that we're going to touch on. And then we're going to move to the challenge, which is really focusing on, while there are technology aspects of this, it's really a leadership or managerial challenge. So what are some of the organizational dynamics and some of the things that leaders should know that they face in addressing the needs that situation poses. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some tips, some ideas, things that our discussants are seeing working, and some models. So I think that you can leave here today with, some tools you can use on Monday morning or something in your team. And I think if you're a seasoned professional, it might be a good refresher. And even if you're not directly connected in cyber, maybe you'll see the perspective and a new light with some of the things that we're going to touch on in that section. So regarding that situation, it's apropos that we're having this session today, and it's not hyperbole to say that the threat has never been greater than it is right now. The evidence points that we see cyber threats and cyber attacks now involving not just data, but core systems. So it's not just an industry 4.0 thing, it's basically just a business operational thing that these threats, if left unchecked, or unmitigated, really disable the ability for a company to do whatever its mission is. And it's not only a personal data threat about identity theft, which is certainly here, or some inconvenience, but literally disabling the ability for companies to do their mission. We're seeing those attacks from both inside, outside, and now, probably not a surprise listening to any of the news of the last 6 months or a year, but nation state actors that are taking the charge up to have an impact or an influence on other governments or other companies' operations. And then we're seeing an incredible rise of cost and impact of those things, both financially, in terms of reputation. Many times these things result in fines. And so the cost has never been greater. And we're going to outline that in just a few highlights, just to try to quantify how large this is. Now, some of this you can take with a grain of salt, because it can depend on, it's very difficult, I think, actually, to estimate these costs. But when I look at estimates like these, and maybe you do as well, you're looking for a confluence of the evidence. And I think the preponderance of insight that we can get from many different points of view is that the costs are increasing and never been larger. Here we have a global study by Accenture and the Ponemon Institute estimating that up from 2017, the costs have risen now to about 13 million in the global sample across 11 countries, nearly 2,600 or so senior executives responding. And we're seeing that it's targeting certain industries perhaps more than others, and we'll have our participants talk about that. But if you're a bank or utility, a software company, highly likely that these things are already top of mind, but I don't think that if you're in a different industry that you can rest on your laurels. Indeed, the quote is, there's only two kinds of companies, those who have been hacked and those who will be. So it's a real cybersecurity is really an issue for all companies across the board. We see significant increases here, either year over year, or you can see the trend over the past 5 years. 72% is significant. Outlining that further, there's other estimates that when you really take it into account, the broad breadth of costs that are associated with these kinds of attacks, whether you're trying to mitigate them or just sort of recover from them, from the lost data, and you really take that and quantify it, the intellectual property that could possibly be lost in this, maybe direct embezzlement or fraud that is associated with these attacks, the cost is outrageous. I mean, $6 trillion we're talking about now, going from, in a prior slide, fractions of a global GDP to something significant. And I've seen ranges actually that we're headed to somewhere between 6 and 8% of global GDP being associated with either recovering from these kinds of threats or direct losses because of them. So it's rather significant. And at the same time, we're in a double bind. So we have a greater threat with greater costs than ever before, and yet the industry is unable to actually provide enough professionals. So there's a real gap in labor around providing enough professionals to mitigate these things, and that's really forming a force multiplier. In our little hamlet here of Phoenix, we already have somewhere between 6,000 or 8,000 different jobs that are unfulfilled. And so CIOs are really concerned about this, as I think it's definitely a boardroom issue. At least we're all in agreement as discussants that it is, but maybe some of you participating are not seeing that this is as high a priority as you think it should be, or maybe you're frustrated that it is such a high priority. Why do you have to do those two-factor logins anyway? We'll talk about that. So I'm going to pause here and just ask, actually, I thought I might start with Bianca. I know that your organization has been focused on some of these job gaps and needs, also pressing up against some of these expenses. So do you have any reaction to this, or what you're seeing with the companies that you're working with, either in directly or in the group that you formed?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. It appears that it becomes a priority for the leadership only if they're personally attacked, or if their company is and has been attacked, and then we can think about, oh, maybe we need to budget this, maybe we need to have some sort of systems or protections in place. So I advise all of you to make a strong case to your leadership and then really show those figures and bring the data and tell them it's, again, a matter of time, and that funding for cybersecurity has to be a budget line item. Otherwise, you'll end up paying a lot more once you have to react to that attack or breach. Yeah.
Anthony, I know you and I have had conversations about this, either how difficult it is for companies to get their minds around being prepared. What can you speak to, either on the cost side or on the talent gap, to actually address the need that you're seeing with Phoenix NAP or your endeavors?
Well, yeah, and on the talent gap, here's the challenge, right? Is you can want to do security, you can want to be good at it, but the problem is you're not going to find the talent that you need. And when you do find that talent, retaining that talent longer than 3 months is next to impossible in this market space. And one of the things with Phoenix NAP's solution to that really is about saying, hey, go with an aggregator, go with an outsourcer, go with a managed security service provider, and you focus on your core business. Let them handle the security for you and handle those kind of problems.
Yeah, definitely. I think cybersecurity as a service is going to be a new trend. I see it in the educational world, higher ed and K-12, where we don't really have the funding for a CISO or appointed resource to watch the logs and react to those kind of threats. So we've been talking about forming consortiums to have a better buying power so that we can use CISO as a service as an option.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I want to touch on something Bianca jumped on, which, and we'll talk about at the end, is security is not about just watching the logs and kind of reacting to the triggers that come up, right? There's a whole threat intelligence enrichment component. There's a lot of components to it that an organization needs to do to be effective.
Aileen or Milena, can you speak a little bit from your perspective? I know that your firm is focused also on a global perspective on these things. How can you highlight how these trends are affecting in your space and your world, the clients that you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to add as well that the idea of the CISO as a service or cybersecurity as a service is a huge trend that we're seeing, and one that we're directly impacted by as a consulting firm. This is a huge kind of, I guess, creative response in the cybersecurity community to the shortage that we're seeing. And I actually just was having a conversation about this with a colleague yesterday. Is this trend going to continue, or at some point are regulators actually going to have a problem with the outsourcing of security? And the perspective I got was that it's actually the opposite. Regulators are seeing the enormous benefits of bringing in outside consultants to respond to this issue because of kind of the diverse experience, right? So you'll have a better more qualified CISO who's used to dealing with different clients across different sectors, rather than trying to find a full-time one who it's extremely competitive, and CISOs jump around a lot. And so I think we'll be seeing that more and more, and sounds like it's for the better. I'll pass it over to Milena.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an increase among the tech sector in terms of people starting to understand that their geopolitical risk vulnerability does lead to the types of attacks and compromise that they're seeing. So there's definitely a bigger awareness of the issue, but it is still primarily reactive in nature. And what we're trying to do is really help companies understand that having a proactive geo-cyber policy to help drive more cohesive integration of what they're doing, both on the technical side and then understanding their geopolitical risk exposure and the opportunities afforded by a changing geopolitical landscape is something that can be done more proactively and can help them save money in the long term, like Bianca mentioned.
All right, so I think you're hearing firm agreement across all discussants. As a point of just tactics today, we're getting some comments about audio feedback, so I'll just remind the discussants, if you can mute in between your discussions, it might help with some of the feedback. So highlighting not just the costs, but how pervasive these challenges are. Most of the participants on the phone are going to be probably familiar with the next few slides, because indeed you're probably among those who have shared your information unwittingly on the with others on the dark web and otherwise. And I guess this is sort of like a World Cup of either cyber hacks or breaches, if you will, because of the size and the magnitude that they represent. And so I'm going to touch on some of these, but also I want to recognize that the nature of these attacks and challenges of how data is being shared inappropriately, and then the consequences of what's changing. So, going from something like LinkedIn passwords being shared, or the point of sale for customers at stores like Target or the Home Depot, primarily in the US, is something that we hear, unfortunately, almost daily. But then we have attacks like what were happening in the Ukraine on the power grid, actually a series of attacks which actually caused blackouts in the country. And this is really a new nature of a threat, a new option for nefarious actors. And it's one thing to see or hear that your password's been taken, maybe some personal identifying information in the US, like a social security number or a passport number. We don't always see that. Actually, I think this is one of the challenges. It's one of the social psychological challenges of these things, is there's an event, but you don't see an immediate impact. And so it's easy to become complacent. We're going to talk about that in just a bit. But when you're talking about infrastructure, you can't really escape that. And there's definitely a direct cause and effect of those systems going down, and then you don't have power. And I think that might be an unfortunate preview of what's to come. An omen, if you will. Looking a few more at the greatest or worst hits, it's not just these consumer companies that have our data. You see on slide 11 here, we have a number of sort of born digital or new age kinds of companies like Facebook, Instagram, Yahoo, but we also see credit bureaus and government agencies. So we have two examples here: Office of Personnel Management exposing records of a large number of folks that are working, and that's not just those that are directly connected to the government, but also contractors. So a huge number of people impacted with pretty sensitive information down to fingerprints. And then we have just this week, actually, I believe it was released that FEMA had shared inappropriately records with a contractor. And I think this is another trend that that we can highlight, that it's not necessarily the case. In fact, you'll read often that the press release says there's no direct evidence that the information was used inappropriately. But that's sort of the challenge, right? We don't really know. And that means that something that we trusted or expected that information be protected, and yet here at least it was internally shared with a contractor, but it was inappropriately done, and that violates that trust. And it's really sensitive information when you're talking about the personal data there. I'll highlight the last one because it probably affects everyone that's joined today. Between 2014 and 2018, if you stayed at a Marriott property, there's a real good chance that they've got your passport number or other kinds of personal information. And this ranks as one of the highest top 3, at least in terms of size to date. So again, I'll just pause here, and I can start again with Bianca just for coordinating comments. Any response there, Bianca? Just, people hear about these things all the time, but there's not a direct cause and effect. What do we make of this if you're a leader in one of these organizations? And, how do you help reconcile that this is becoming so relatively commonplace?
Yeah, so what you do, then you have to have a really good, cybersecurity curriculum available for when this happens. First of all, you have to have a good communication plan to explain to your organization and its members how it happened, why it happened, to be very transparent about it. And then to really say, to really ask for them to own a piece of this, because one of the most increasing threats that we're seeing is the phishing attacks, which is impacting the users directly, and we do need their support, their ownership of and fighting this. So being very transparent, communicating, and just saying, this happened, this is what we're doing to address this, and this kind of the systems we have to put in place to be more proactive. But at the same time, our users, our customers are very central to this program. So really having the training and awareness in place.
So Anthony, I hear Bianca say, partly it's the customers and users and the employees have to take responsibility. We can't just think that those bad actors are going to stop doing what they're doing. How realistic is that, and what do you see for Phoenix Snap in your role?
Well, so I think there's 2 parts to that, right? It's in the work I've done in looking at how do we mitigate some of this. It goes all the way to the top. It's the posture of the leadership sets the culture and climate of the company, right? Culture and climate sets behavior. And in order to modify behavior in the rank and file, you've got to have that corporate culture that is supportive of the security posture. Cybersecurity is not IT's problem. You can't just throw it over the fence and say, hey, IT, go deal with this, right? It goes all the way from the entire company, the entire leadership has to say, hey, this is an ethical responsibility of ours to protect our customers' information. After all, we asked for it. And so because we asked for it to use it, we need to protect it. And then you're going to start to see a shift in, basically, if you look at cybersecurity today, it's like I honestly say, we compete for dollars with the janitor, right? It's like there's only a limited budget within the company, and we're sitting there competing for that. And we're not looking at this as a holistic solution. We're looking at this as, hey, just slap these solutions in and expect it to work. So that's kind of my longer term goal, is to see us actually start to think that way and implement those strategies within the organizations. And then people will come up with creative solutions that will kind of counter the creativity of the bad guys. Did that answer your question, Peter?
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more, I think, about that in the challenge and the solution. So hold on to those ideas. I want you to share a little bit more. Aileen or Milena, when you're talking about global geopolitical risk, and I think it's one thing to say that it needs to be a top to bottom solution, but it's probably more complex than any one company can do. Doesn't government or other policies need to be in place to put this into appropriate perspective and have appropriate controls?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, and just wanted to add, anybody in the cybersecurity industry has heard this phrase a million times. It's not a matter of if, but when. And that's why when we talk about cybersecurity programs, it's all about preparedness and what we call cyber resiliency or cyber resilience. As far as governments being involved in this, absolutely, it's come to a point where there's no escaping that. A lot of the focus has really been around breach notification laws, which, frankly, are insufficient in terms of prevention of future incidents. And so, a lot of this has to do with planning and simulating these kind of events to know what needs to happen after they do happen. at this point, when an event has already taken place, it's really important to think about the reputation of the company. At a global level, we're seeing, more understandably, more and more cynicism around these companies' desire and ability to protect us and really put our privacy first. So I think, that's not going to change very easily without a concerted effort from both the private and public sector.
Milena?
I agree. I mean, you have to think about some of the forces at play here. We had a sort of economic reality where companies treated the data they collect as a gold mine to be sold and to be shared and to be made money off of, instead of something very secret to be protected and cared for. And because consumers demanded, the freemium model of things, they had to trade some sort of data to be able to access things for free. The reason all of these membership programs and loyalty programs are free is because they make money off the data you give them. And so I think there are definitely three players in this: the corporate world, governments who have to come in and create the right regulatory and compliance mechanisms to protect people, and the people themselves who need to demand better and to really understand what they're trading in these free programs and these free benefits. Unfortunately, up until now, governments have not really done a very good job. I mean, we just saw the EU pass a really embarrassing copyright law that pretty much everybody dislikes. But just like GDPR, they felt they had to do something. And so a lot of very tech illiterate government people passed, a law to say they did something, but the effectiveness is very much in doubt, and it hasn't really changed behavior, which is the goal. So I think we're still trying to crack the code of how to make those three parts of the trifecta work together and work effectively.
Actually, I want to add something to that, which is interesting. One of the things Arizona has actually done is the governor stood up the ACT, the Arizona Cybersecurity Team, and the goal there was actually for technology folks to interact with policymakers and actually make a difference in policy. And if you followed some of the meetings we're having around this, we're actually having dialogue with the government, with these policymakers that are non-technical folks, and being able to kind of guide them and educate them through the process. So it is a model that has definitely started. Does it have challenges? Sure. But I think that needs to become more and more. It needs to be countrywide, right? Or worldwide.
Right. Well, I think all of us agree. We've been watching this space. I think we're better off 5 years from 5 years ago, but we're very much in the middle of this process. And so we have sort of incomplete, and it's very much a Wild West. We have GDPR, which is a big milestone, I think, last year. Countries like France, states like California and Utah seem to be taking a lead, and maybe Arizona is going to be among them for some of these rules. But it can't just be a stick. I think there has to be other solutions, and not just about fines. And not all these actors necessarily were trying to be willy-nilly about protecting the data, but just bad things happen. Actually, that's the next slide that we want to look at, that these attacks have really become more diverse. So where does, it's a slippery slope. Many of us now are probably familiar with the ransomware, encrypting everything on somebody's computer, requiring some kind of payment to have them unlocked. Could affect a PC or a whole server at an enterprise. Denial of service, which can take whole operations down. I think a new one emerging is cryptojacking. So unbeknownst to you, your resources in terms of bandwidth, computing power are used to mine. And then Anthony, I think you and I were talking about the business email compromise. Maybe you can remind folks what that looks like and how pervasive this threat is.
Yeah, so I think by now everyone's got an email from their boss or from somebody saying, oh, by the way, can you transfer this X amount of dollars? I'm in the middle of a conversation. I'm in the middle of a negotiation. I'm sitting where I can't access my phone, but go ahead and transfer this money to this account, or go to the store and buy some gift cards and send it to this address. And a lot of people are falling for that because it came from an email address they verify. It looks like the CEO or the CFO's email address, and kind of the counter for that. And one of the things we always tell people is pick up the phone and call the person and ask, because you already know the email box is compromised. So don't email them back and say, hey, is this really you? So things like that. The business email compromise is very, very prominent right now for some reason. And a lot of people are falling for it. And we're talking $10,000, $20,000 crimes that are happening around that.
So I think it just highlights, that the attacks are morphing and they're becoming more insidious, and it's hitting people at a weak point, because we all have that kind of click whirl when there's somebody in authority that needs our attention. We're prone to act, and so it's taking advantage of our human weaknesses to, in fact, be a good soldier, be a good actor, and these knee-jerk reactions sometimes can compromise a whole lot more than even dollars. In the interest of time, I want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about some of the next part of the agenda. And indeed, we touched on some of these, on what are the challenges. We're talking about these relationships that matter, and some of the perceptions and challenges. And one of the trends that we can definitely see globally is that the C-suite is becoming increasingly concerned, but they don't all necessarily, I think they're concerned in part because there's not a good answer. It's a complicated answer, right? It requires a lot of coordination and new things. But a global survey by PwC looking at thousands of executives, 40% are ranking cyber as something they're extremely concerned about. That's up over 20%. And we see when you rank regions globally that cyber is ranking very, very high, sometimes above other kinds of threats like terrorism, geopolitical risk. And maybe they're concerned about that, and this is really, we touched on this already in the call today, is that the pervasiveness of this, and then the resting on one's laurels that something is maybe solved or mitigated sort of lulls us to sleep, and this becomes a vicious cycle. So there might be a crisis. Marriott might have gone through realizing that those records were shared and patched it up with some kind of response, often liberating the very budget that I think Bianca and Anthony have mentioned, that it's so difficult to fight for. So then there's some monocle improvement. There's some sense of we've solved that, and so we can kind of go back to business as usual, which then, of course, leads to the next crisis. So this CIRC model, this cycle of complacency, is, I think, a challenge that we're seeing often in organizations. We're also seeing that it's a misalignment of priorities. I think, Anthony or Bianca, you might have mentioned that you're competing with budget. I think you said with the janitor, and I'm sure there's some great janitors out there, but the point is that there's a lot of competing priorities that the C-suite has, and often the technical leaders may not have the same perspective as the C-suite leaders, and so that can affect budgets. And indeed, Bianca, I think you mentioned that we need new relationships with partners. So this is a very challenging thing, because you're asking them to, you're trusting them with the most sensitive parts of the operation in Industry 4.0 with all the data. So I'll just pause here for a reaction to either just, how the perceptions might be different across these senior leaders, and that cycle, that vicious cycle that we can get into. Bianca, anything on that?
No, I think it takes, a good posture, and I can speak to that in a second. Maybe Anthony has something to add on this, because he's one of the partners that organizations look out for, or Milena or Eileen.
Yeah, and actually I was just going to touch on, kind of cue Eileen up as well. So Eileen and I have been working on kind of a think tank idea, kind of trying to understand how different indicators, different geopolitical influences actually affect cyber. And one of the things where we've looked at is, how do people relate to cyber, right? How people relate to cyber in some of the European countries is very different from how we relate to cyber. So we have to take that into account when we anticipate cyber solutions, because we think everybody follows our rules. And we think everybody thinks that, hey, getting somebody's information is okay. And Eileen, I will cue you up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally really interested in sort of cultural differences and how they yield different cyber expectations across different, types of people. I think, it should come as no surprise, Milena mentioned the freemium model, that in America, our kind of hyper-capitalist, mindset allows us to prioritize, business over kind of the personal right for privacy. I think that this is not really going to change, but I think we can look to models like Europe. GDPR is not necessarily seen as very effective, but at least the intention and the kind of expectations of the citizens there are very different than what we see here. And so as companies are putting policies into place and practices into place, they should really think about, the implications, not just where they're based, but also in other parts of the world. But yeah, and one thing I keep hearing mentioned, and I think is really important, is different roles within the organization. Security, you said same budget as the janitor. It has a lot to do with how much authority those that are in the security department have. And so there's an evolving discussion today around what is the role of the CISO or sometimes the CSO. It has the letter C in it, but is it really part of the C-suite in practice? And so historically it hasn't been. It's always been kind of subservient to your traditional CTOs, CFOs, CIOs. Now that's starting to change because of all these breaches. And so it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over the next couple of years and kind of how the dollar distribution, reflects priorities across different organizations.
So one of the things that we're hearing then, you have this alignment of priorities and budget. But Bianca, there is another challenge, I guess. It's not just at the C-suite level. Maybe it's a broader kind of cultural level. I think we're going to speak to that, looking at this idea around posture.
Yeah, absolutely. So industry geeks call it like cybersecurity posture, which doesn't mean anything until you put duck pictures on it. So here's our 4 examples. So the first one, this is the IT people you don't see, but they have it under control. We're cool, stay calm, we got this, right? The second one is more often than not, you're in the just tell me when it's over situation. You do your best, but it's like pretty overwhelming. Then there's lovely Chihuahua that locks down pretty much everything in sight. This is draconian IT, and I think we're also, most of us familiar with that. I think those things are kind of changing, but it's like we need to lock it down, right? And my favorite one is the last one. The Titanic is sinking, so you might as well keep dancing. We're just gonna say we're pretty much, we don't have much else to do. We're just gonna put our hands in the air and go for a ride.
Right. So you would see these different postures. It's in jest in part, but it's a serious thing. Like it's a culture that the leaders are setting, but also us as part of the organization. We partake in some of these roles, and whether our reaction is something that's welcoming, or is it so draconian that we're dreading going to work every day. Actually, I think we're going to talk about some of that and the challenges. And then that actually can lead to this quilted reality that you were talking about. Depending on the posture here, you might end up with different pictures here, right, Bianca?
Absolutely. So the outside circle is the reality of the world, and the inside circle is the reality of our organization. Right? We talk about culture, but the outside culture is also affecting our inside culture. So the outside world is a dynamic landscape, and the threats change daily. I know we talked at length about this today. And then cybersecurity attacks never get worse. They only get better, right? A patchwork is a reality. So external threats keep changing. Internal constraints on budget and personnel means we're constantly doing triage. And also no tool or platform does it all. We all build our own patchwork quilts of cybersecurity. So each quilt is unique and complex and therefore difficult to manage. And I know, we really spoke to that. You cannot just put one kind of band-aid on something, or you cannot have one solution because the challenge is so complex. So you have to think of this reality as a really quilted one, where it's very, everything is interdependent.
And as that complexity develops, you actually have more risk, because it's not just, there isn't one place for all the data. There's no one tool that's going to solve it. And you need, there's people involved here across the process. I think you were going to speak a little bit more also about that here.
Yeah, so I mentioned insider threat and how we have to really, ensure that every one of our users has a part in this, has an ownership. So because the one challenge a lot of people don't think about, we call as insider threat. And yes, most IT people at some point, which they could remove they think they could remove the people from their companies, but that is reality, and humans are fallible and they can be tricked, like in phishing scams. And sometimes humans are lazy, sometimes they get careless when they're tired, and some even become vengeful, right? We know an employee, stories of employees who left and want to take revenge on their companies. The bottom line here is that IT leaders have to anticipate the fact that humans are part of the business. What can we do about that, right? So what are the solutions? I think we have one slide on that.
Well, I think we should go to that, actually, in the interest of time. I think it's a good segue. So when we're talking about solutions as a team, we understand that we're talking really in a way out of both sides of our mouths. There's kind of a paradox. This is related to having the appropriate posture, but Bianca, how do you balance that? And I think that we can definitely relate to some of these examples that we have here that people might go outside the system if it's too locked down. And I think this is good advice, but it's going to be difficult to implement this.
Yeah, and I think, I mentioned the posture. A good place to start is the right posture. You assess where your weaknesses are, and then you improve your posture because you know where you started from. So this is where you decide which one of those dogs you want to be. A reasonable way to approach this decision is to understand your customers. So you have that the customer mindset, like hypervigilance is good to have, but there's so many risks of fostering shadows IT. Our system is too slow, so I'm going to just use my Dropbox, although you might have an enterprise solution, right? And because this need is maybe aligned to a business's need, it's hard to make a case for not having the shadow IT, but as a leader you have to really put a stop on that. Another option is to consider what is a risk. So we have to protect accordingly, right? You have limited finite resources. You can direct those resources to the kind of the things that's going to get you the most value for that funding. So library of cat pictures versus credible car data versus health records versus strategic plans. And again, it comes to your governance strategy or business strategy, right? What's important to the business? Because you cannot do it all because of that complexity. And then, as I mentioned, I know I don't want to over speak to this, but you do have to train the humans rigorously and repeatedly using a high quality curriculum and delivery mechanisms. Really, that transparency, the openness, why we're doing this and why we need everyone's help.
But as we were discussing this as a team, one of the challenges in taking this, especially the training the humans, is as we highlight here, oftentimes the cyber resources are utilized to focus on mitigating the problem sort of immediately, but it doesn't really get deeper than that. I was wondering if you could speak to this, maybe Anthony then as well. Yeah,
absolutely. So another element of the solution is threat intelligence. So start with that as well. That's where we answer why we get attacked and who attacked us. Most companies never get to the threat intelligence because it takes time and it costs money, and money that they haven't budgeted for, right? But then there is tremendous value in it. Were we targeted because we had financial data or defense system plans, or were we just targeted because we had a system that is popular to target, right? Who targeted us is another important question. Did this attack come from a competitor or the Russians? Or did it come from the neighbor in the building next door who just was fed up with the construction noise in our parking lot? It turns out that those are important things to know, especially when an auditor or a board member asks you. Anthony, do you want to have your input here as well? I know you have quite a lot to add on the threat intelligence.
Yeah, can we go to the slide on the threat intelligence, Patrick? The picture. So the thing with threat intelligence is like when you look at antivirus software, you have the more updated you are with the signatures, the better you're going to protect yourself against the threat. Threat intelligence is exactly the same way. Is the threats are happening in real time. They happen every second of the second. I think it takes, you stick an open machine on the internet, but within 27 seconds, it'll be compromised. Like that's how quickly these things are happening. So there is no organization that can just say, hey, I put a SIM in and I'm good, because you're not getting the latest threat data. So you're not protecting from all the threats that are happening out there. So I am a big advocate that if you stand up a threat management program, you do have to stand up or interface with some sort of threat intelligence program that feeds this information to you in near real time as possible so you can defend against the threats that are coming at you. Especially if somebody else got hit, you don't need to get hit by that. You want to protect from that hit because they already took that hit and they already produced the results. So what's mapped out on the screen is basically my methodology of what we follow in how to enrich a threat vector, how to identify whether it's real or not. And the thing is, last year the stats say 53,000 IOCs happened. There is no organization that can process 53,000 IOCs. So what you have to do is pick the ones that are critical to your organization, work those first, and then work the rest down.
So,
I can go for an hour on that. So.
And IOCs being?
Incidents of compromise.
And these solutions you're talking about, it's not just a technology. I can't just go buy this off the shelf. Right? It's a combination of technology, people, and processes.
Yes. What we call TTPs, tactics, tools, and process.
Right, right. So I know I want to get to a few of our audience questions, but I do want to just look at the sage advice that we were following here as a top line. I think at a minimum to get started, there's little disagreement that organizations ought to be thinking of it and leaders should be thinking about these things. And if they're not seeing these things, it would be at least an indicator, Anthony, that, well, they probably definitely don't have the rest of what you got.
Absolutely. Like you have two-factor on here. Like two-factor, you got to implement two-factor. That's just what it is. Passwords are no longer safe, and it's not going to be in. Well, it's not even passwords, even passphrases. The two-factor definitely adds a level of complexity that protects your systems. Yes, it's a pain. Yes, you do have to reach for a text message, but the thing is, it will. If somebody's hacking your account and you get that text message at 2 a.m. and you go, huh, that's interesting. Why did somebody in Indonesia try to log into my bank account? You know somebody's attacking you. So that's one of those things. The other thing is different passwords, different areas, that kind of like basically be vigilant. Don't put information out there. I will add one thing, Patrick, is where do you think the information people get about your password is? It's on Facebook. You put your favorite place to visit, your kids' names, all of these things, if you notice, are password reset pieces of information. Don't put your real birthdays up there. Don't put that real information up there because then people can't use it against you. So that's part of lock it down is really where I was going with that.
Right. You know, if we were to say, what's the next, part of the challenge here is that we're dealing with sort of antiquated ways of solving this, passwords maybe being one of them. You are seeing more talk of sort of what's next. Are we really just in an odd stage where we're dealing with old solutions like a password to even authenticate? What about biometric? What about other kinds of solutions that users or companies can hang their hats on? Are those panaceas? Or are they just going to open up different problems?
Here's the thing. It's not about one tool. Like biometrics are great, but biometrics can be bypassed. It's what it is. What we're looking at is a combination of factors that create the authentication, right? The two-factor or the multi-factor authentication, something you have, something you know, something you are. That goes a long way to protect you, but that's not enough because we've already heard that you can compromise the facial recognition. You can compromise fingerprints. So it is going to be multiple factors of these things that's going to create your login. So is it going to be a lot harder? Yeah, it is going to be a lot harder. But that's what it's going to take to protect the access to that information. Bianca, anything to add to that? Eileen?
Yeah, this is Aileen. I think, you know, a lot of this sounds like common sense to us, but we tend to overestimate kind of the common denominator of understanding at different organizations. We have to remember that, you know, we're not just dealing with IT and engineers, but also, you know, people who come from different generations, different cultures, and may not even have the baseline of understanding that we do. And so you know, we've crafted a lot of security awareness programs, and we've learned a lot about kind of our, let's say, constituency through those. And it's really important to cater the awareness training, or really any kind of training, to the individuals, or at the very least the groups that you're dealing with. There are a lot of solutions out there, and I think that that's probably one of the most important factors in selecting one or in building your own, is something that's designed, you know, like I said, by department, so that you're giving the most useful information for those.
Colleagues, I'm just mindful that we're approaching the top of the hour. We do have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience, so I'm just going to move here. We really have covered basically the planned content. And Aileen or Milena, maybe this is one for you. Looking globally, are there either good models that we can look at in our companies for best practices? Is there either an organization or an institution, could be a government, that you think is taking the lead? So if somebody wanted to educate themselves on the options that are available, do any stand out?
I don't think, again, there's any one that has cracked the code yet. But I think it's better to see the areas where there's more dialogue between companies, governments, and users. There's been a lot of research done by places like Citizen Lab and other sort of organizations that are committed to educating people and to exploring the very many issues. Clearly, we've seen the governments that are using surveillance technology, biometrics, and all of that for oppression. But we haven't really seen a lot of governments taking a stab at really finding the balance between liberal democracy and how to handle data correctly, without sort of falling back on very traditional types of legislation that were written for a different time and for different types of technology and different types of information protection. So I think we're still finding our way. But if you're really looking to educate yourself, look at the researchers who are doing the important work of exploring some of the unintended consequences of legislation and the unintended consequences of some of the technological progress that's happening around the world, and who's using it and for what purposes.
Well, I think that's actually maybe something we can do as a team as a follow-up. Is I'd like to provide some resources to the participants today in addition to a copy of the slides. And so I think we can augment that either with some of those examples or or others that they could follow, podcasts and such, with some of that to stay up to date, because some of the questions we're getting are about that. Being mindful and respectful of everyone's time, and that we're at the top of the hour. I think we've had the beginning of an excellent conversation today that needs to continue. And so maybe we can tee that up and address other needs, as this space is very dynamic and changing, obviously with many global implications for businesses and leaders. And so we thank you today for your time and attention, and we'll turn this back over to Thunderbird.
Great, thanks, Patrick. We appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I think this was, a really interesting topic, and I think you're right. We could probably have a webinar a month just on this topic to really delve in and get into it more deeply. But we appreciate the time that everybody has spent joining us for this. I wanted to just, end this by saying thank you again for joining. We hope that you will continue to find these monthly webinars useful. We hope you'll reach out to us and give us feedback on topics you'd like to hear in the future. And also reach out and talk to us about other ways you might be interested in getting engaged, whether it's, serving as a mentor for existing students who are on campus, or if you're interested in referring students, or you have positions within your companies where a student might be able to, do a job or an internship. We would love to have you engaged in that process with us, and we hope that you'll reach out to us and continue to join us in future webinars. So next month, just as a reminder, will be the last Wednesday in April, April 24th. And we will hopefully hear from all of you then. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.